Hello, and welcome to week 10 of high school mythology. So, this week we are going to be talking about Midas and some of the other minor myths. So, I'll go ahead and pull up our slides now. So, you may already be familiar with the story of Midas. You've probably heard of the golden touch, right? So we won't spend as much time on that as we will on some of the other myths that are probably not as familiar to you. So Midas was the king of Phrygia. And one morning he went out and he noticed that Silenus was passed out in one of his flower beds. So Silenus, if you'll recall, is that character who has to ride a donkey because he is typically too drunk to walk, and there are times also where he is so drunk that he falls off of the donkey. And so that must be what happened, right? That caused him to end up in the flower bed of King Midas. So King Midas finds him and takes him in and is very hospitable towards him, takes care of him. And then he takes him back to Bacchus. Remember, we talked about Silenus being associated with Dionysus, who is the Greek god of wine, or Bacchus, who is the Roman counterpart, the god of wine. And so Bacchus is so thankful to Midas for bringing Silenus back to him that he tells him he will give him whatever it is that he wishes for. So King Midas wishes that everything he touches turns to gold. So in King Midas, we see the fatality of folly, right? He does not set himself up as equal to or greater than the gods, right? So he does not exhibit hubris. However, he does exhibit folly, or to, use a not as nice word, he's not very smart. He's kind of stupid, right? So he doesn't think about it ahead of time, what it really means, right, to have everything that you touch turn to gold. Therefore, he's unable to eat, he's unable to drink because everything he touches turns to gold. So over time, he realizes that this was not a good wish. So he goes back to Bacchus, and Bacchus tells him to go wash in the river. And once he does, he is no longer cursed with, right, this golden touch. However, there is gold that is discovered in that river. So we again see in this myth an explanation for something that happens naturally, right? This natural occurrence. The explanation for why there's gold found in the river is because, oh yeah, Midas had the golden touch, and then he went and washed it off. Another story about Midas is that he was asked to judge a musical contest between Apollo and Pan. So Apollo is the shining god, right? The god who has the gift of the lyre or lyre, who plays the most beautiful music. And Pan plays music that's nice too, but he plays it on the reed pipe, and it could in no way compare, right, to the music played by Apollo. However, when Midas judges which of the two plays the best music, he chooses Pan over Apollo. So this infuriates Apollo, right? And so Midas again exhibits folly because you don't want to judge a lesser god to be of a higher standard than a greater god, right? So Apollo is angry, and he turns Midas's ears into donkey ears. He says, if that's all the good you can hear, right? If you can't distinguish that my music is better than Pan's, you only deserve donkey ears. So Midas continually wears a covering over his head so that no one will see that he has donkey ears. However, he has a stylist, right, who has to cut his hair, who knows that he has donkey ears, and he's sworn to secrecy. However, the stylist cannot contain himself any longer, so he goes and he digs a hole, and he whispers into the hole in the ground, Midas has donkey ears. Midas has donkey ears. Then he covers it back up, right, with the dirt. So the secret's safe in the hole until the reeds start growing in that area. And once they get high enough, every time the wind blows, they tell the secret. The rustling of the reeds in the wind whispers, Midas has donkey ears. So there we go. The fatality of folly as illustrated by King Midas. The second of these minor myths that we're going to talk about is the myth of Escalapius. So Coronis was this lovely maiden who fell in love with Apollo, and he was in love with her too. However, she falls in love with someone else. So you know that is not going to end well for her. So some variations of the myth state that Apollo is the one who kills Coronis, and there are other variations that say it was Apollo's twin sister Artemis who killed her. But at any rate, as Coronis is being placed on the funeral pyre, Apollo decides that he wants to save his child because at the time of her death, Coronis is expecting his child. So he saves the child. The child is named Escalapius. He sends the child to the centaur Chiron, who is the one that trains heroes. Also, Chiron has medical knowledge, so he's training Escalapius. But Escalapius ends up being superior even to Chiron in his medical expertise. In fact, Escalapius is so good at what he does that he's able to bring someone back from the dead. However, that does not set well with Zeus because in Zeus's eyes, anyone who can raise someone from the dead has more power than Zeus does. So he strikes down Escalapius. Well, then this infuriates Apollo because Escalapius, of course, is his child. So then Apollo goes and slays the Cyclopes, which in turn infuriates Zeus. So Apollo is made to make a penance, right, or repay his debt by working for King Admetus. So there's just this snowball, right, of revenge, which is not something that we haven't seen multiple times before, right, especially in dealing with gods. But the important thing too to remember about Escalapius is that he is honored on earth. If you look here, the snakes represent him. You still see that representation with the medical field today with the snake around the pole. People on earth continue to go to the temples of Escalapius to find out how they could cure their illnesses. He would also come to them in dreams too. So even though he died, he still played a major role in the lives of the Greeks. Then we have the story of the Danaids. 50, yes, 50 daughters of Danaus. And they are pursued by their cousins who want to marry them. But they do not want to marry their cousins, and their father also does not want them to marry their cousins. So they go and seek refuge on an island. And so the people of the island consider them as suppliants and protect them from these cousins. However, it's kind of like if you're thinking of a blank or a black screen between scenes in a movie. It's like we kind of have that happen. We leave off with the people of the island protecting Danaus and his daughters, keeping them from having to get married when they don't want to. However, when it opens back up, right, you could also think of it like a curtain closing and then the curtain opens back up. And when it opens back up, the Danaids are at a wedding feast with these 50 cousins that they have now married, and their father rather is presiding over the feast. However, he gives each of them a gift on their wedding night, and the gift that he gives them is a dagger so that they can kill their husbands while their husbands sleep, right, on the honeymoon. First first night of the marriage. However, all of them do not follow through. One of them doesn't. The merciful Hypermnestra. She refuses to kill her husband. For this reason, Danaus is angry with her, and in some variations sends her away. In other variations, he has her imprisoned. There are also variations of the myth that have Hypermnestra reunited after her imprisonment with the man that she married, because she did end up falling in love with him. However, the 49 of her siblings who actually did kill their husbands are punished eternally. They are made to carry jars with holes all in them to the water and fill them up with water. Of course, as they start going back, right, all the water comes out because there's holes in the jars. So they're eternally forced to fill holy jars with water, in a much similar way to the story of Sisyphus, right, where he has to roll the stone up the mountain or hill and it rolls back down. So it's constant, right? It's never going to end. In the same way, this never ends for the Danaids, who continue to have to try to fill these jars with water. Then we have the story of Glaucus and Scala. And in this story, once again, we see evidence of the god or goddess that falls in love with a mortal or some other type, maybe a nymph. But at any rate, it never ends well, or very rarely ends well, for the mortal or the nymph. So Glaucus is fishing. He's a regular man at the opening of the myth. And as he has the fish lying on the grass, he notices that they're able to start moving around and go back to the water. So he's like, there must be something magic in this grass. So he eats this grass, right? And when he does, he goes into the water and he begins to transform at least his bottom half into a fish. So he becomes a water god. He falls in love with Scala, who is a nymph, and he goes, tries to pursue her. She's not interested in him. So then Glaucus goes to the sea witch Circe for help in being able to woo Scylla. However, Circe herself falls in love with Glaucus, but he turns her down. He only wants Scylla. So Circe gives him a potion and says, okay, you give this potion to Scylla, then she'll fall in love with you. Well, of course, you can't trust the sea witch, right? And it is not a potion to make Scylla fall in love. Instead, it is a potion that turns Scylla into this terrible monster. And she makes an appearance in the stories of Odysseus, in the story of Aeneas, in the story of Jason and the Argonauts. She's that monster on the rock, right? She's attached to this rock, Scylla, and they have to make sure that they travel exactly between Scylla and Charybdis, the water monster, or like the big whirlpool, right? So Scylla is the monster on the rock that we see featured in these other myths, all because Circe did not want Glaucus to love Scylla. She wanted him for herself. Then we have the story of Erysichthon. He is a king who goes out into the woods and chops down the sacred tree of Ceres, who is the Roman name of Demeter. And he gets multiple warnings of why he should not cut this tree down. First of all, his servants refuse to do it. They tell him, this is the tallest tree in the orchard. This tree is sacred to Ceres. We will not cut it down. So then he does it himself. And as he hits it, the blood flows from the tree. And there is, a voice coming from the tree saying, do not do this. You will face consequences. But he doesn't care, and he does it anyway. And we see the wrath of Ceres in this myth in a way that we don't typically see it. Most of the time, she is this goddess of fertility and the harvest, very nurturing. Even in the story where Persephone is kidnapped by Hades, kidnapped by Hades, Demeter's reaction is one of sorrow and mourning, not really one of anger and vengeance. She doesn't refuse to allow the flowers and the earth to flourish because she is being vindictive or angry. She's that sad, right? She's mourning that much for Persephone. But in this myth, we see her enact vengeance against Erysichthon. She causes him to be visited by famine. So in this myth, famine is personified as this spirit. So famine visits Erysichthon, and then he is constantly hungry, but no matter how much he eats, he still wastes away. He continues to be hungry. So he ends up having to sell everything that he owns, trying to buy enough food to satisfy him. Once everything he owns is gone, he sells his daughter into slavery. However, she obviously does not want to be enslaved by anyone, so she makes an appeal to the gods. And so the first time she does this, they turn her into a fisherman so that when the person who has bought her goes to look for her, he cannot find her. All he sees is a fisherman. And she goes back to her father and tells him what happened. And so her father sets up this money making scheme where he continually sells her for food or money to get food. And then she continually shapeshifts. However, eventually, Erysichthon is ultimately punished by continuing, no matter what, to waste away at an even more rapid rate, so much so that he ends up being so hungry that he devours himself. So this could also be seen as a warning against gluttony, because he continuously consumes and consumes and consumes, all because he consumed something at the beginning, the tree, right, that he never should have. And then we get the story of Pomona and Vertumnus. This story conveys a sense of disapproval for women who reject marriage. And this would tie in also to the Roman ideals that we mentioned in the story of Aeneas, right? The fourth one being the ideal of marriage. And so that aspect of Roman order is seen in this myth. There's also a connection to Halloween because Pomona was an overseer of the orchard, and apples there had properties of divination. And we see that at Halloween, this idea of bobbing for apples and caramel apples and candy apples. And also, even back in Celtic folklore, apples were used for divination purposes around what they would call Samhain, or what we typically refer to as the Halloween time of year. So in the story of Pomona and Vertumnus, Vertumnus is a young man who is in love with Pomona. However, she has no desire to get married. She instead wants to spend her time in her orchard caring for her apples. But Vertumnus visits her in disguise as an old woman and begins to tell her that she's going to invoke the wrath of Venus if she continues putting off marriage, and gives her these examples of other women who have shunned marriage and been punished by Venus. And then the old woman moves into talking to her about how much Vertumnus loves her and how she should really marry Vertumnus. And then the old woman gets a little kissy with her in a way that's not typical for an old woman. And she realizes at that point something is going on. And then Vertumnus shifts back into himself and tells her that he loves her and that they should get married. And they do end up getting married. And then both of them care for her orchards. So that is the short little video for this week. And then next week, we will be looking at the other minor myths in alphabetical order. So there are quite a few of them. So if there are any particular ones that you would really like to discuss, feel free to put that on the classroom page as you're answering the questions for this week. That way I can be sure on the next video to spend maybe a little more time on the ones that are of most interest to you. So I hope you've enjoyed week 10, and I look forward to seeing your replies on the classroom page. Goodbye.